So with this video podcast, I am announcing that the daily podcasts, so with the daily podcast with Sam Yogi has been closed. We have bifurcated the two podcasts, the one on the Krishnamurti podcast with Sam Yogi as a new show called The Ecstasy of Life with Sam Yogi. That will be a podcast inspired by the teachings of Jiddu Krishnamurti. And in fact, the podcasts have started from where we left off. We are cutting it off with the 95th episode in the daily podcast with Sam Yogi. So, the 96th episode of The Ecstasy of Life is in a separate show called The Ecstasy of Life with Sam Yogi. That's an English-only podcast. So, it is for the speakers of and the listeners of the English language. And the second podcast, which was in Hindi and which when given to a couple of American friends was demanded why this podcast on Vedanta was not in English, has been bifurcated into a show called Sadhana Path, Yoga and Vedanta in two tongues. So look for a show called Sadhana Path or Sadhana Path, Yoga and Vedanta in two tongues. That's it. Sadhana Path, Yoga and Vedanta in two tongues. The two tongues being Hindi and English. So it is a bilingual podcast show. Within this show, we have Yoga and we have Vedanta. Both are bilingual. The Vedanta is the one that is continuing. It's called Swami Niranjanji Podcasts with Sam Yogi. It was always called Swami Niranjanji Podcasts with Sam Yogi, but it was in Hindi. Now it is in Hindi and English. So it is also good for my Hindi listeners, a lot of whom do not have that much proficiency in English, so they can learn English. And those who want to learn Hindi can also listen to this podcast. Frequently there are chants in Sanskrit, and also sometimes the commentaries are being verbatim distributed or discoursed in Sanskrit. So actually it's a podcast in three tongues, but I did not want to say Sanskrit because it's mostly the chants. Now, in the yoga section, it's called Yoga Podcasts or The Yoga Podcast with Sam Yogi. The Yoga Podcast with Sam Yogi. So these two separate podcasts, Yoga and Vedanta in two tongues. Sadhana Path. Look for Sadhana Path, Yoga and Vedanta in two tongues. That's the show. It doesn't have the name Sam Yogi in it. Look for it in Spotify or Apple Podcasts. I am going to bring it back on Amazon. It used to be there on Amazon.com, and I did not know that they were distributing it for free on Audible. So I have found that out. Now, Sadhana Path, Yoga and Vedanta in two tongues is the name of the show, in which, if you subscribe to this show, you will get both the bilingual podcasts, Yoga and Vedanta. These are two separate podcasts. Vedanta is called Swami Niranjanji Podcasts with Sam Yogi. Swami Niranjanji is my Vedanta teacher, has been my Vedanta teacher since I was 16. And the Yoga Podcast with Sam Yogi is based on what I learned from Swami Niranjanji, the mudras, and prior to that we used to have a Yoga Nidra book, I believe it was, in English. And at the age of 12 I read it. Back then we did not have any YouTube or tape recorders to record it. So I recorded it in my mind, and then I followed the instructions, and I had an out-of-body experience, and I was only 12 years old. So when I told that to my father, he did not believe it. But I have been interested and practicing yoga since I was 12 years old. So at the age of 25, I went to America, and I basically continued my practice there all through my life. I got married at 29, but I kept practicing. My son was born when I was 33, and I went to the MIT Sloan School of Management. I got my MBA from what was then the number one business school, the number one B school, not A school, B school in the world as per the US News and World Report. And then I moved to Silicon Valley and worked with various high-tech technology and marketing companies in San Francisco and in the Bay Area. And I continued my practices. A lot of mudras I learned when I paid a visit to India in 2015 and discovered more of these mudras. I always was practicing with this called the Chin Mudra, and there is another video on YouTube where I am showing the Chin Mudra, and if you look back at the date, it's probably 2012, 2013, 2011, something like that. But here we are in 2025, and we have some experience with mudras, which I'll talk about in the yoga podcast, in the yoga podcast with Sam Yogi, and that we have 5 or 6 episodes out, and we are trying to make it a weekly episode. And there I sometimes talk in Sanskrit, the detailed commentaries I read out in the podcasts, and as required I translate those commentaries in Sanskrit. And the verses are from various scriptures, and we are planning to get into, for example, the Yoga Sutras, where it says, Samana Jayat, for example, a sutra is Samana Jayat Prajwalanam. The conquering of the Samana Vayu leads to effulgence in the form of fire. And this you can correlate with the Vedanta podcast episode 108, which I have been clipping into short videos for various media outlets, where from Prasnopanishad it talks about how the Samana Vayu distributes the food around the entire body. Now, assimilates the food, helps the body assimilate the food by distributing the assimilated essence throughout the body. It has 2 aspects. One is, as we say in Hindi, jaisa khaoge anna vaisa banega man. As you eat the food, so becomes your mind. The corollary to that is, the essence is being distributed throughout the body through samana. So that essence has to be sattvic. Hence, the force, the stress, the focus on vegetarian food. Now, the second aspect of Samana Jaya Prajwalanam is the Upanishad talks about a fire sacrifice. The fire sacrifice is in the belly itself. The food that you get is oblated in the fire that is digestion. And the food thus digested in the fire in the belly is distributed through samana. And then in this discourse, which is episode 108 of Swami Niranjanji Podcasts with Sam Yogi, the 108th episode, which is available now on Spotify. It is within this new show, Sadhana Path, Yoga and Vedanta in 2 terms. In this new show, the old series of podcasts is continuing, Swami Niranjanji Podcasts with Sam Yogi. We are now onto the 109th episode, which will be published next. And this podcast can be looked upon from the very first show in Daily Podcasts with Sam Yogi, Swami Niranjanji Podcast, episode 1, 2, 3. But the later episodes, we are talking about Prasnopanishad, which delves into the 5 pranas, which are prana, apana, avyana, samana, and udana. So I will go into the details of these more when we talk about these in the yoga podcasts with or the yoga podcast with Sam Yogi. So that much, I think this much is enough to make you understand that this daily shows with daily podcasts with Sam Yogi is over. Now I will place this, since I did a little Bhastrika at the beginning to demonstrate what Bhastrika was. I will put this as the closing podcast in the daily shows, but I'll also put it as the yoga podcast, the next episode, whatever that episode is, in Sadhana Path, so that both the subscribers benefit. And as usual, when we put it on Anchor, the host, which is now bought by Spotify, YouTube pulls the graphic card and creates a video. So if you are comfortable with YouTube, the channel is Samrock Cafe, SAMROCKCAFE, and we have all these podcasts nicely in the podcast playlists, and you could look it up that way also. Thank you. You have a wonderful day. Now, in हिंदी ब्रीफली, तो हम कह रहे थे कि ये डेली पॉडकास्ट विद सैम योगी समाप्त हो गया है। अब हम स्वामी निरंजन जी पॉडकास्ट विद सैम योगी को हिंदी और अंग्रेजी दोनों में कह रहे हैं, और ये दोनों कहा जा रहा है, ये पॉडकास्ट अभी एक दूसरा शो बना दिया गया है, साधना पथ योगा एंड वेदांत इन 2 टर्म्स। उस पर सर्च करें, सर्च मारें स्पॉटिफाई पे या एप्पल पॉडकास्ट पे, साधना पाथ योगा एंड वेदांत इन 2 टर्म्स, तो आपको मिल जाएंगे ये स्वामी निरंजन जी पॉडकास्ट विद सैम योगी, जो कि हिंदी में और अंग्रेजी दोनों में है। और यही साधना पाथ योगा एंड वेदांत इन 2 टर्म्स में एक दूसरा भी पॉडकास्ट बाइलिंगुअल, वो भी हिंदी और अंग्रेजी दोनों में कहते हैं, हम शुरू किया गया है। उसका नाम है द योगा पॉडकास्ट विद सैम योगी, एक नया पॉडकास्ट है योग पे। तो इसमें सिर्फ हम योग की बातें करते हैं। कभी हम संस्कृत में भाषा पढ़ते हैं और उसका अर्थ हिंदी और अंग्रेजी दोनों में सुनाते हैं। तो ये सुनने से आपको 2 लाभ होंगे। एक तो आपका ज्ञान बढ़ेगा, वेदांत में योग करने की इच्छा प्राप्त होगी, और दूसरा ये है कि आपकी अंग्रेजी भी अच्छी होगी, क्योंकि हम जो हिंदी में कहते हैं उसको अंग्रेजी में कह देते हैं, या फिर पहले अंग्रेजी में कहते हैं उसका अनुवाद हिंदी में कर देते हैं। तो ऐसा है। तो चलिए ये शो खत्म कीजिए, डेली पॉडकास्ट विद सैम योगी, और ये दी योगा पॉडकास्ट विद सैम योगी में इसको वीडियो पॉडकास्ट करके डाल देंगे। हम तो ऑडियो पसंद करते हैं, लेकिन कभी कभी वीडियो करना भी जरूरी है। तो चलिए आनंद से रहिए, आपका दिन मंगलमय हो। हरि ओम तत्सत, हरि ओम तत्सत, हरि ओम तत्सत।